Why is it that so many people from the young, restless, and reformed movements from the 2000s leave? Now, before I get into the topic here of this video, I just want to make a quick mention that the American Lutheran Classic series that we published, we're putting out second edition. So we've just released the second edition of Volume 2, which is on conversion and election by Francis Pieper. So as you're thinking about issues of Calvinism and Arminianism and Lutheranism on these various topics, you may want to check that out if you want to get a good Lutheran approach to our view of those issues. You can go to jspublishing.org. So now I want to jump into the topic of the video, and this is just a question that I've gotten on a lot of my videos, particularly with the talk with Flame, who was kind of one of the major figures musically in the Young, Restless, and Reformed, loosely so-called, movement. And the question is, why is it that so many people who were part of this movement have left? Some of them leaving the faith altogether, some of them being part of other Christian traditions like Lutheranism, some of them becoming Anglicans or Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. So it is true that there are many people, some are major figures in the movement, but others just followers of the movement, people who were young and got involved in it, and they kind of fell away. So if you're not familiar with the Young, Restless, and Reformed, back in, I'll just kind of give you my little story about it. Back in 2005, I graduated high school, and so that's the year that I started college. And it was around that time that Calvinism became really cool and really popular. It was a big trend. Now, I was familiar with Calvinism anyway. I was part of an EPC church, a Reformed, more of a conservative EPC church, but a Reformed congregation. I had a Calvinist Bible teacher in high school, so I feel like I knew this stuff some, but I got really excited about it when I went to college because I went to study theology at a Reformed school. So of course, being at a Reformed school during kind of the height of this movement, you're going to get a lot of it. But there were a lot of really cool things happening at this time. There was a lot new online. So monergism.com, for example, was a website that got really popular. This was a way for you to be able to read and access all sorts of theological articles and lectures and do that for free. You didn't have to pay much for poor college students, So monergism.com got really popular. Banner of Truth Publishing got really popular as they were reprinting a lot of works of the Puritans, and some of them were, newer, updated revisions of that. Preachers like John Piper ended up getting really popular on social media. Things like YouTube began, and people were posting content on there. And Sermon Audio became a popular website where you could download particularly a lot of Reformed sermons. And it was not exclusively Reformed, but at least at the time, that's what I was taking in. And there were new podcasts all the time, and there were all sorts of things happening. So there was even, kind of a soundtrack to the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. And that was a lot of the rap music that was really popular at the time. You think of people like Flame or Lecrae or Shai Linne or Timothy Brindle. There were a bunch of these guys who at the time were really speaking a lot about Reformed theology more specifically. So there was a soundtrack. Oh, Derek Webb was another figure that a lot of us listened to who did later apostatize, sadly. And, preachers like Mark Driscoll got really popular, people who were teaching the 5 points of Calvinism. So, and this was a big part of their preaching. So I was part of that movement, and it was exciting at the time. There was a lot coming out. The Amazing Grace documentary, if you've never seen that, we would invite people over in college and have like movie nights where we'd watch this like 3-hour documentary on Calvinism. So all of this was happening. It was exciting because this was what was so cool about this in the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, because I'm not going to just throw it all under the bus, was just that all of a sudden it became okay, and not just okay, but even cool to talk about your faith and talk about it in an intellectual way. And I think what was happening in evangelicalism before that was that what a lot of us grew up with was a very unthinking evangelicalism, an evangelicalism that was very, very kind of feelings-based, didn't have a lot of focus on things like apologetics, maybe some at a popular level, but it wasn't particularly good. And the new Calvinism was, for a lot of people, the first time they really encountered a Christianity that was intellectually rigorous, we had questions and they actually had answers to those questions. So I think one of the reasons why it got so popular was because it did have those answers. It provided something that was much more robust historically, intellectually, and practically as well than the kind of weak evangelicalism without much of a really message at all that was popular, probably more so in our parents' generation. So this was all well and good, and these parts of the New Calvinism I think were good. But the whole thing kind of imploded in some ways, and people ended up leaving. Some of the major figures ended up apostatizing altogether. I mentioned Derek Webb, the musician, who was part of this. You had, the blow up with Sovereign Grace and C.J. Mahaney, and then Mark Driscoll. So a lot of the major figures disappeared for one reason or another. They're out of the public eye. Not all of them have done that, but there's been a lot of bad things happening there. But I don't think the reason that people have left Calvinism, especially the New Calvinism, is really just about those leaders. I think there are broader issues. Now, one of the things, and I could spend a long time talking about this, so I'm trying to summarize what I think are some of the main points since I keep getting this question. One of the things that I think which was really helpful about the New Calvinism at the time, when, especially for the age group that it was popular for. It was largely popular for millennials, not exclusively, but I'm within that generation. So for us, it was really great for a couple of reasons. One is that they had answers to all of our questions, and we felt like evangelicalism wasn't answering those questions. And the other thing was, in the New Calvinism, truth is very black and white. And in a culture that's increasingly moving toward this idea that truth itself is relative, and there's such an emphasis on experience and emotions, having clear black and white answers of this is absolute truth, this is not absolute truth, I think was very appealing for a lot of people who are trying to navigate just the ramifications of postmodernism and the post-Christian culture that we're currently a part of, and those things haven't gone away. But what I think happened is that the answers in, especially the New Calvinism, were too black and white. And that when people grow older, they start to see the world in a very different light. Because when you're young, you want to argue, okay? Especially like young, male college student, at least this was me, theology student. It's like, I want to fight, I want to argue, I want to bash those Arminians and show them why they're wrong. Kind of the reason why those Ben Shapiro clips where, Ben Shapiro destroys whoever get popular, especially among college age conservatives. It's just, I think at that age, you're really kind of wanting to fight. You see things very black and white, and you want to have the answers, and you want to have them clearly. You want to think you know everything. But then as you do get older and you look more at life, you really start to realize that the answers are not always that black and white, and that truth is not always that clear. Now, I'm not saying truth is relative or anything like that at all. There is absolute truth, and we can know it because God's revealed it to us in his word. But what happened with the New Calvinism is there was really not much room at all for things like mystery. There's not much room at all for questions that really don't have answers, and places to say where God has not revealed those answers to us, and we hold on to some tensions. New Calvinism just didn't really have a place for that, because I think we wanted to have answers. So even if the answers were not exactly what was said in Scripture, we wanted to just stick by those answers. And that's a tendency for a lot of young people. And I think it makes a lot of sense. But I'm very different, at 32 now than I was at 22. And I'm sure at 42 and 52, I'll be very different as well. And the more I've thought through life, and I'm still, relatively young, the more I've seen that it's not always that easy. And a lot of times the arguments that are made for something like the 5 points of Calvinism in particular don't really deal with a lot of nuance. And I think you'll see this, especially as you look at a doctrine like limited atonement. And I think what was popular, at least among my friends and peers when we were into this, was, there is no sense in which Christ died for the non-elect. He only loves the elect. He doesn't even have any love for the non-elect. I mean, it's very black and white. But then when you look at actual historic Reformed theology even, and start looking at what limited atonement means or particular redemption, and you look at some of the what's actually taught in the Synod of Dort and some of the allowances that are there, it's actually not that black and white, even within Reformed theology. So I think what ended up happening is people started to realize, wait a minute, this isn't all scriptural. Wait a minute, we're giving answers that scripture itself doesn't give. And people start to look for something that has more grounding, I think both historically and intellectually. So while the new Calvinism had more grounding in both of those ways than I think typical popular evangelicalism did, it really doesn't bring people far enough in those directions. So that's one of the reasons I think people have started exploring other Christian traditions. Now, myself, I explored Lutheranism. I know plenty of other people from that movement who have come into Lutheranism. But there are individuals who have become Roman Catholic, who have become Eastern Orthodox, or have become Anglican. And what I've even seen is even a lot of most of the people that I knew who were, listening to John Piper all the time and Mark Driscoll and these major figures within that movement are no longer this kind of amorphous Calvinistic Baptist 5 points of Calvinism are the height of all theology. Because what they've done, those who are still Reformed in some sense, have moved to a more confessional Presbyterian position, or they've moved into something like what was the Federal Vision movement, which I don't know is really much of a thing anymore. But they've moved toward these other positions because they've realized you can't hinge your faith on the 5 points of Calvinism. The Reformed tradition can't even be defined by the 5 points of Calvinism very well at all. This is really a very truncated, in a way, caricature of an actual tradition rather than the actual display of that tradition itself, at least in the way that it showed up at that particular time. So I think that's one of the major factors, is just that, or two of the major factors really, is, one is that they're looking for something more historical, more intellectually robust than just limiting their theology to this one particular subject area. And the other is that we begin to realize that there are plenty of mysteries of our faith that we just don't have answers to. And a theology that tries to answer every question is not necessarily good. There are questions that do not need to be answered, and in fact cannot be answered. And the third thing, and I think I'll give maybe four, I don't know, I didn't do a 5 reasons series with this. I didn't do like 5 reasons why the new Calvinism is, but I guess I could have. So I think the third reason really is this kind of obsessive introspection that showed up with the new Calvinism. And this is especially true with people like Paul Washer. I mean, he's the greatest example of this. I know I bring him up all the time, but he's the clearest example. But someone like John Piper is, I think, this to an extent as well. Not to the extent of someone like Paul Washer, but it's because of Piper's influence from Jonathan Edwards, who was very focused on motives and being, looking internally. And I think when you're doing that, especially when you're younger and really excited about your faith, I think you tend to expect this progress and sanctification that doesn't always happen. And sometimes it does, because say you're a new convert and you're just discovering scripture and you're really diving into it for the first time, and you feel like there's just this growth in your faith and you're getting excited, and this process of sanctification just really feels like it's going to be just on the upswing. And when you hear these guys like Paul Washer talking about the necessity of having fruits, it's like encouraging, and you're like, I'm going to kill sin, I'm going to grow in my faith. And then the realities of the world hit. And I know people who were on that track of being excited, fell into sin, and then just rejected the faith because they said, I guess I'm not elect because I'm not progressing like I thought I was. This is too hard. I give up. And, I think the reality is as you get older, you do see that this progress and sanctification, and it's not that it's not real, that God is doing this work in us, but it's not this like upward, constantly getting better thing. Like, you may fall back into some really bad sins. You may encounter new sins the older you get. And so this kind of constant introspection is just not going to work, because when you look at yourself in light of that introspection, you're going to see that you're not where you should be. You're going to see that maybe you look back on the last year and you don't feel like you've grown in your faith. And you see places where you've fallen short. So I think what that's going to cause is one of two things. One is to just despair and feel terrible about yourself and your Christianity. Or the other is that you start judging people who aren't you and judging them as not saved, because that's kind of the only way that you can protect yourself, is by looking at other people and feeling like you're not that bad because you're not as bad as this person or that person, which is what I see a lot of kind of Paul Washer fans end up doing. Not that they all do that, but I think that is certainly a tendency there. So, I think that's another reason why the new Calvinism led people away from it. They had to. I mean, this is why things like the Federal Vision, even before, I mean, this kind of Federal Vision rose probably around the same time as the new Calvinism, but they were even sensing some of these issues before this obsessive introspection. And the new Calvinism just heightened that, and people, I think, have walked away from it because of that, because you can't survive in the Christian life on that. You can't, practically. And then the other thing, I would say probably the fourth thing is just that part of it was just that it was a trend. And culturally, this is just a problem, is that we are in the midst of trends. We are in the midst of, one thing is cool for a while, then it's not cool anymore, and you drop it. And it was like the emergent church was cool for a while when I was in high school. And then that wasn't a thing anymore. Now everybody that was into the emergent church that was reading Rob Bell was now reading Mark Driscoll. And now the new Calvinism was like the cool thing. And then some of those people moved to whatever the next cool thing was. And there are many, there's no like one clear after the new Calvinism, there's this thing. But a lot of people follow one trend or another, what happens to be popular. And this is just a problem in our culture in general, is that we can't just hold our attention span or even keep a conviction for very long because we just get distracted and want something new. So that's not necessarily a good thing, but that's probably the reason why a lot of people grabbed onto the new Calvinism. I mean, you have to realize that some people just grabbed onto it because it was a trend, and like, this is just what Christians were believing and doing at the time, so we grab onto that. Now Christians are not believing and doing those things anymore, so we move on to the next thing. And some people are just kind of swept along by whatever is cool at the time. So some of it is that there just were no genuine convictions there. With that being said, it's not the case that if you left and now have another theology, that you were never a Calvinist in the first place. And this is what I see from a lot of people. It reminds me of my time in the straight edge movement in the hardcore punk rock scene, where you make this commitment in straight edge to not smoke or drink or do drugs or have promiscuous sex. And then if you break edge, you're like out of that group. And it said like, you never were edge if you're not now. So it reminds me of that. And it's like the idea of once saved, always saved, like once Calvinist, always Calvinist. So this is just not true. Like, people do change convictions, and it doesn't mean that you didn't have conviction. And yes, there were people that were genuine, that were just kind of grabbing onto the hype and trend. That's very true. But it doesn't mean that no one with genuine convictions left. There are plenty of us who really wrestled with the text and had to like go through this. And when wrestling with the text, came to the conclusion that, yeah, we had convictions, but those convictions could be changed. And as Christians, we should always be willing to do this, right? We should always be willing to go where the text goes. So we should never be in a place where we're so dogmatic about our theology that if Scripture said something else, that we wouldn't change our theology. Right? If you could prove to me that Scripture did not teach what is taught in our Lutheran confessions, and that the theology of Scripture was completely opposed to our Lutheran confessions, I would abandon those confessions. Of course, I don't think that's the case, which is why I'm a Lutheran. But we should always be willing to go where Scripture itself goes. And a lot of people doing that found that they didn't think that Calvinism actually had the best, didn't summarize the teachings of Scripture in the best way, and that there were a lot of texts that really were being explained away. Now, I know a lot of us kind of memorized those ways to explain away all the universal passages, Matthew 23:37, and Peter 3:9, and 1 Timothy 2:4. We've got our answers. 1 John 2:2. We've got our answers to all of those ways to explain them in a Calvinistic reference, in Calvinistic perspective. But then there's the question, but like, what do the texts really say? Like, you can explain it from that perspective. You can find a way that it means something else, but in context, what is actually happening? What is actually the argument that's going on, and read it for what it is, instead of going to the text and asking, how can I make this fit with Calvinism? And I think that's what a lot of people did. So anyway, those are just kind of a few of my thoughts. And, nowadays it seems like a lot of the people who have kind of stayed on to that really strict 5 points of Calvinism are my theology A lot of those people even have kind of moved into really political arguments nowadays, even from what I've seen. Those who are more strict on specifically the 5 points are not even really arguing theology anymore. They're just spending time arguing about political issues, and that's not to say that those aren't important. But I think even with those people, there's been a shift since that time. They don't even seem as interested in the theology anymore that they used to be diving into all of the time. They're still just as strong about those convictions, but they seem to be more interested in arguing about cultural issues instead. So, just my these are just some of my thoughts. So let me know what you guys think. This is just kind of off the cuff remarks because I've gotten this question a lot. I'm not, trying to give this definitive answer of this is why every single person has left the New Calvinism. This is just my experience and some of my thoughts. So I would like to hear from you guys. So leave comments below and let me know what you think. If you left that movement, if you didn't leave that movement, and you feel like you're still part of it and you've still kind of grown into that, let me know. So anyway, we will see you in the next video. God bless.